reinventing marriage, I think part of the book was I wasn't trying to provide a manifesto for marriage as much as just begin to open the question to say, you people are smarter than I am. Figure this out. I mean, and you need to figure it out for your own life too. What's working for me probably will not work for you just because we're different.
Yeah.
Everybody's just different enough that we have to sort of find our own way in this. And so part of what I outline in the book is beginning to think about what are the different ways that we need human beings in our lives. That what used to take a village, somebody, we need friendships, we need people, activity partners, we need stability in our lives in terms of, and then as you mentioned, the polyamory folks. Sometimes people get to that point where they're like, you're a great parent, you're a great financial partner, we have this life together, but at the end of the day, I've got to find ways to find, love and romance outside of this,
Yeah.
and they do that, and
Yeah.
with the consent of their partners in it. And so I think, looking at it from a theological framework, I don't have a problem with that. But
Yeah.
but yeah, this gets back to, again, this sort of notion that one man, one woman, one lifetime, that
Hmm.
somehow this is a simple formula that's in the Bible,
Yeah.
and that this has been passed down since the beginning of human history, when that's not at all what we see in human history. We see polygamy. We see people who really have no relationship, don't really make a correlation between love and marriage in the same way that we do.
Yeah.
uh, the book of Song of Solomon's a great example of this, or Song of Songs, right? There's this couple, and they're just in love, and they're playing around sexually, and they're having a great time, and it's pretty clear from the context of different clues that we pick up in the book that they're not married.
Nothing is forever, you're so keen on telling me. Yeah, everybody's worried, saying that I'm in too deep. Keep it all together, move on to bigger things.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're sitting down with Dana Hicks to talk about his book, The Knot, and it's subtitled How to Secure Healthy Modern Relationships While Not Being Tied to Marriage's Past. We have a lot to talk about. So, Dana, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Oh, thanks so much, Glenn. It's so glad to be here, and a big fan of your podcast, and so excited to talk with you today.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Have you you've listened for a little bit?
Yeah, for a little bit. Yeah, and just appreciate your journey and the questions you ask. I think they're really helpful for sure. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So we're going to get into the book in a moment, but maybe before we do, if you could take a few minutes to introduce us to yourself, especially for
Yeah.
people who aren't familiar with you, your work. Who are you? What do you do? Give us a sneak peek into the life of Dana Hicks.
Well, I grew up in a pastor's home, and a third generation, um, I guess, ministry person,
Hmm.
and spent 30 years as a pastor, and wearing a bunch of different hats. Taught at a seminary, adjunct
You mean as a
for.
pastor, you wear more than one hat? You just you don't just preach and that's
It's
it?
true. It's true. It's true. But not only did I do that, but I also had other things on top of that. I worked for a nonprofit, did some work in the nonprofit that we started
Yeah.
for some economic development projects in Africa, and did some leadership training at a seminary, coached church planners, did a whole bunch of variety of things. COVID hit, and to make a really long story short, I ended up retiring from ministry, and
Mm.
just part of that was burnout, part of it was COVID, part of it was just kind of questioning whether I could give myself to this anymore. So these days I like to write, and
Mhm.
which has been fun because it allows me to say things that I couldn't say as a pastor, and
I know that feeling.
tell the truth. Yeah, yeah. To tell the truth as much as possible, which is fun. That's becomes more my question is, more about the truth than about, how will this play.
Hmm.
So that's kind of fun. And so I'm writing, and I also work for the United Way, doing different social projects here in the Phoenix metro area, overseeing those, helping expand some of those things. And so that's actually, I tell people I'm doing Jesus work, just other people are paying me to do it. So it's
That's
great.
right. It's a different form of Jesus work, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
That's awesome. All right, so your book. Here's the deal with the book. In full transparency, first of all, I'm your student today. When I picked up this book and I saw that it was about marriage, I've read a lot of marriage books in my day, and so my first
Mhm.
thought was, I wonder if it's going to be one of those marriage books, right? Like I do these 3 things or stop doing these 5 things, and here's what the Bible really says about marriage. But it was really nothing like that at all. And I found myself discovering things about marriage that I never ever knew before, in particular, things about the history of marriage. And so I thought that we could maybe start there because a lot of people, I think, wrongly assume, and I was one of these people for a long time,
Mhm.
that like westernized American marriage is what marriage has always been. It's what marriage will always be. And it's like the best
Mhm.
definition of biblical marriage. And so, assuming that some of our listeners maybe are there or have been there at some point, take us into this topic
Yeah.
of marriage, like about how it's evolved over the course of time, how we arrived at what we have, like in the US typically today, with the rise of romantic marriage, I think you call it in chapter 2. Just take us wherever direction you want to go. I'm all ears.
Yeah.
I'm ready to go.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my journey is similar to yours, Glenn, in that a few years ago, I picked up a book by a woman named Stephanie Kuntz, who's a historian out of Evergreen College in Washington State. She's not a religious person, as far as I know, and wrote the book just from a purely historical framework, looking at marriage, comma, a history is the
Mhm.
title of the book. And she just traces it from really the dawn of um, the agricultural revolution to today. And it's
Mm.
just fascinating. The book was fascinating to me. And again, like you, blew my mind in terms of I just assumed marriage was, I grew up in an evangelical church that kind of
Right.
taught me that the way we do marriage now is the way Jesus taught us to do
That's
it,
it.
and
Came right from the
and
right from the man
yeah,
himself.
exactly. Or probably Moses taught us, or Adam and
Right.
Eve. I mean, it goes way, 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 way back. But when I read the book, it became really clear that the way we understand marriage, as I call it, romantic marriage,
Mhm.
has only been around for about 250 years. Really, for the vast majority of human history, marriage was very different. It was about survival.
Mhm.
Mostly, people got married so that they could eat and they could not die.
Mm.
And it really had, and of course, there's exceptions to that. I'm being very
Sure.
painting with a very broad brush at this
For sure.
point, but for most of human history, people got married because it tied them together with their community. It allowed them to create alliances between clans and tribes.
Mhm.
It allowed them to uh, create more workers for the fields.
Mhm.
And there was a real economic drive of the reason that people got married. And it created a legitimacy to them passing on inheritance of property in
Mhm.
particular.
Mhm.
So marriage as an institution really didn't come about before the agricultural revolution because we really didn't need marriage before that.
Mhm.
And the idea of owning stuff didn't really come about until the agricultural revolution. We were hunter gatherers. We human beings were hunter gatherers. We just kind of wandered around, did our thing, and the idea that we had to sort of make sure that our progeny carried on the property, the real estate that we owned, wasn't an issue. So
Mhm.
marriage wasn't always around in human history, and the way we understand marriage today is only about 250 years old. So about 250 years ago, people began to sort of question the origins of marriage. Most marriages, of course, in human history are arranged.
Mhm.
Parents would work out these arrangements to try to create a positive situation for the family. It wasn't about love. It wasn't like two people fell in love and the parents acquiesced to that. It was
Mhm.
the parents said, no, you're going to marry this person because we need to water our flocks in their in this watering hole kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, about 250 years ago, people began for the first time in human history to make decisions for themselves as to whom they will marry.
Mm.
There was huge pushback, especially from the church at this time, because why would you leave such an important decision up to hormone filled young adults? This is just
Right.
a prescription for disaster, you know.
Right.
Hormone filled young adults do not make good decisions about who they should marry. And turns out they were right. That, you know, they said the divorce rate's going to go through the roof if you let people marry or let happiness be the basis of marriage. And they were right. It did
Yeah.
go through the roof. And so that's sort of what sort of happened in human history, is that suddenly marriage became a shift from how do we survive and make it to the next day to how do I allow marriage to make me happy. And when we
Hmm.
started asking a different question of marriage, it created all kinds of unintended consequences of for what marriage could be. Now, of course,
Yeah.
I'm not advocating that we go back to arranged marriages, and I'm sure most of your listeners wouldn't be fans of that either. But I do think that we've had this experiment for a couple 300 years now, and we can kind of take a step back and say maybe romantic marriage isn't the end all be all, and we can maybe begin to think of marriages in new ways. Marriage has evolved in the past into
Hmm.
to become different than what it has been. Perhaps we can allow marriage to continue to evolve, and we could ask different questions of marriage and what that might look like. So that's a short summary of really the book and how it kind of ties into the history of it.
Yeah. So now, did this shift from marriage being about survival to romantic, which we said about 250 years ago, did that have anything to do with the cultural shift as well, kind of moving towards individualism, towards that
Oh, for
rise of
sure.
the individual, like it's all about me? And we see that even like in the church in terms of salvation, like it became all about me and my personal relationship with
Personal
God. Like
relationship with
did
Jesus.
all those
Yeah.
shifts kind of tie into one?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, some of it was philosophical, some of it was
Hmm.
economic too. You know, the Industrial Revolution allowed people, you know, it used to be that you relied on your parents to pay a dowry for you to have a bride.
Yeah.
Well, the economic or the Industrial Revolution allowed young men to then raise their own dowries, and they weren't dependent on their parents anymore. So there are economic factors that played in, there were philosophical things that played in, and there's sort of this perfect storm that sort of came about at that time that shifted the way in which we understood marriage.
Yeah. So you talk about these unintended consequences of romantic marriage. What are some of your thoughts about that? Because you have a whole chapter on that in the book, which I
Yeah,
thought was really good. And I never, again, it's like something I never considered because you just take for granted that this is the way that it is. And so, yeah, there
yeah.
might be some problems, but the problems are probably my own fault for being this fallen, sinful creature. That's just what you were taught, right? So I must be not be doing it right. But what are some of these unintended consequences of romantic marriage that you're talking about?
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback on what
Mm,
you're saying in there, there's a saying in organizational leadership that we say, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets.
mm-hmm.
In other words, if you're getting consistent results out of a particular way of doing something, quit looking at the people and start looking at the system, because
Yeah.
the system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And this is the same with marriage. At some point, we got to quit looking at the people and saying, you just got to love Jesus more. That's why your marriage is so miserable. And maybe start looking at the system itself,
Right.
of what that looks like. But to answer your question about, yeah, so these unintended consequences. So again, I'm not advocating for going back to arranged marriage or anything
Mm-hmm.
like that. And I think there were certainly limitations to the way we understood marriage in human history before, 250 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think people should have agency in who they marry. I'll just go out on a limb and go say
Yeah.
that. We should have agency in that. I think that it's great that we don't view women as property anymore. I think that
Mhm.
that's really good progress in human history. But again, what ends up happening in romantic marriage then is human beings begin to look for their soulmate.
Mhm.
This romantic notion that there's one person that's out there. If I just meet this one person, they'll meet every human need that I possibly could have.
Mhm.
They'll anticipate everything that I'll need in my life. I'll never have to work at this relationship because it'll just be so natural and so beautiful, And so, as a pastor, I would counsel couples that would say things to me like, clearly this is not the person I was supposed to marry because this is hard. And I would
Right.
think to myself, it's always hard,
It's
it's
always going to be
supposed to
hard.
be hard. That's just the
Right.
way marriage is. And so we would put all our eggs in this one basket thinking, if I just find this one person, they'll meet every need that I'll ever have. Most of human history, it took a village to sort of like meet all of those sort of needs in our life. It would take a village of people. We would never put that much burden on one human being to
Mhm.
say, you're going to be my best friend, you're going to be my lover, you're going to be my co-parent, you're going to be my financial partner, we're going to collaborate together on work things. We're going
You're going to
to
be
the
God to
list.
me. Right.
Exactly. I mean, the amount of weight that we begin to put on human
Mhm.
beings, on our partners, was just overwhelming to them,
Yeah.
or began to. We still do. So this whole soulmate idea, this idea that we find this one person, um, it it's a prescription for disaster, really, because
Yeah.
nobody's perfect. Everybody, there's no one person that's going to do that for you,
Mhm.
and no matter how wonderful they are, they're just never going to do that, and we're just not wired that way. And again, it gets back to that, like you're talking about, that sort of autonomous idea that we as individuals don't need other people outside of ourselves, and it's just a myth of the way in which we live.
Mm.
So, naturally, so again, the unintended consequences that sort of come about out of that, we, marriage failures, because people are really disappointed in the outcomes of their marriage.
Mhm.
We become really isolated too. You find married couples, and social researchers are finding that if you're married, you're more isolated than if you're single, which is kind of a bizarre thing to think about.
Yep.
More people identify as lonely who are married than who are single, which is really an odd deal. We isolate ourselves because the idea is that once I find that perfect person, I don't need all these other people. I don't,
Yep.
I don't. These are all peripheral sorts of things, and so we isolate ourselves more. And then purity culture kind of comes about 250 years ago as well. As we begin to define purity in a sexual sense for the first time in church history.
Mhm.
We begin to think of what it means to be pure, uh, in in terms of sexuality as opposed to other ways. We used to measure holiness in terms of like, how well do you treat your neighbor? How well do you treat
Mhm.
the sojourner among you, the foreigner? How well do you feed the homeless? Do you clothe the naked? Those sorts of things. And then all of a sudden, 250 years ago, we began to measure holiness in terms of like, can you keep your pants on when you're
Yeah.
supposed to, which is
Mhm.
really an odd, if you take a step back from it, it's a really odd sort of way to begin to think about it.
Mhm.
um
Where
yeah
did
that's
that,
sort of
where did that, I mean, that's an interesting topic, like that shift in holiness from being something about, like you said, do you care for your neighbor, things like that, to sexuality. Like, was there something going on in the church, in the world at the time that kind of caused that shift? Because I've noticed that, I mean, obviously I've noticed that a lot, but when I was a pastor, it was very striking to me when I went for my first interview at the church to get the job. And they sat me down, and all the questions were about obviously my theology, things like that. But there are a lot of questions about human sexuality, but very little, I would say maybe even no questions about like, how does this theology of yours help you inform your life and the way that you treat people? Like, do you put your shopping cart back when you go to the store? Like simple things like that. Like, how do you treat the cashier? Like, there was just no questions about my day-to-day life of holiness. It was all about my thoughts about human sexuality and things like that. And it was a huge like an aha moment for me. That was just like,
yeah
the church is very obsessed with this and doesn't really seem to
yeah
care about this other aspect of things. I don't know if you have any
well,
insight to
frankly,
that, but yeah.
yeah, I think part of it came about, I talk in the book about Freud and the
Mhm.
Madonna horror complex. I mean, there's a lot of psychological
Deep
stuff, I
stuff,
think,
yeah.
and yeah, that gets into that. But I think part of it too, frankly, I think it's a lot easier to define my holiness in terms of my sexuality than it is to actually care about poor people. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I and now my job is really about, a lot of what I do is trying to find the I mean, my profession that I'm working in now
Mhm.
with United Way is trying to find places in our community that where people are falling through the cracks and trying to, get shore up those sorts of things. And again, just because that's now in my mindset day to day, I just keep thinking to myself, where are all the churches, in all of this? It's really an odd deal, because
Yeah.
it's so much easier to talk about sexuality than it is to get your hands dirty, because it's really messy. It's really
Yeah.
messy work to deal with poor people,
Yeah.
and it's complicated, and they don't. They're not always grateful
Yeah.
like we think they should be. They don't treat us like the white saviors that we think we are sometimes, and
Yeah.
so it's. I think that's a lot of it. It's just frankly a lot easier to think of ourselves, to think of holiness in sexual in terms of sexuality as opposed to the way Jesus defines it.
All right. I want to shift gears. I want to talk. I want to read for you a Mark Driscoll quote, and I want to ask you
Oh,
to respond. Are you ready? Do you need to take a
I'm
sip of
ready.
water? You gonna be all right?
Yeah,
All right.
I am.
He's writing a book on marriage as well, and he's currently doing a
Yeah,
sermon series on sex, which is very interesting. So
he
he's
loves sex.
he does. He loves sex and what people do with their genitals and all the different things. But
Yeah.
anyway, this is a relatively new quote. He posted it on Twitter a couple weeks ago, Facebook too. I'm blocked in both places now because I had something to say about it and other things. But here we
Mhm.
go. This is what he said. I'm going to read it for you and for our listeners. He says, "We will see polygamy legalized in our lifetime. Just because you see it in the Bible doesn't mean it's biblical." There's a quote. We could take that quote out of context and we could for Mark. Probably one of the few things he said that I'm like, okay, maybe that kind of works. But anyway, he says the entire Middle East conflict is the result of Abraham having a relationship with more than one woman. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about this because
Yeah.
I have no idea what you're
Yeah.
going to say. But that statement, especially the last part about Abraham having a relationship with more than one woman being the cause of the entire Middle East conflict, that just invokes rage in me for some reason. But I really want to know what you have to say about this, especially in light of like the history of marriage and just how polygamy, things like that fit into it, and what exactly is going on
So
here.
much. So getting back to our previous, I have a
Yeah.
lot of thoughts on this, but the first thing I thought of when you read through is that, again, getting back to our previous conversation,
Mhm.
how all of a sudden human sexuality is the root cause of all of our social problems, and if we just get people to keep their pants on,
All we got
doggone
to
it,
do.
we can solve all the problems in the world, as if they're that simple to solve.
Right.
That being said, let me give you a full disclosure here too. I've known Mark Driscoll for 25 years.
Mm,
He and I used to pastor in Washington State
mm,
many, many years ago. We met at a leadership network um, event that was how to reach Gen Xers, which will show my age. It was for young leaders, which again will show my age, how long ago that was. But Mark and I became friends because we lived close to each other and we used to hang out a bit together. And uh, we kind of grew apart over the years.
mm,
So I've known him for many years. So that's part of my full disclosure on this.
mhm,
And the thing I've known from Mark from the day I met him, two things. One, he's hysterically funny,
mhm,
which I've always appreciated. But he's also the king of hyperbole, in part because he just loves to get a rise out of people.
mhm.
And he's very, very good at that. I
He gets a
remember
high on that, right?
he does. I remember years ago, I was at a conference with him and he was gonna lead a workshop and they were doing a mic check and he was they said, Mike or Mark, can you talk into the mic and give us the sound? And he goes, yeah, sure, you bet, sodomy, sodomy. So he kept saying over and over again, check 1 2, sodomy, and
Oh
it's just
my
like
God.
he, again, that's just Mark. That's who
Yeah.
he is. He just
Hmm.
loves to rattle the cage, loves to get people worked up, loves hyperbole. So part of I take everything like this with a grain of salt in terms of
Sure.
him and hyperbole. Number one. Number two,
Hmm.
there's the use of the word biblical. I think that he uses in here. That just because the Bible says it doesn't mean it's biblical. The whole concept of biblical has this really weird connotation. I think anybody who's a serious student of the Bible doesn't say that.
Yeah.
Because if you've read the Bible, you realize the Bible, I mean, was written over a period of thousands of years by dozens of different people and different languages and different
Yeah.
cultures and
Yeah.
different. understandings of the world, and to have this sort of notion that, oh yeah, it's just all some sort of cohesive, coherent thing,
Yeah.
uh, pretty much demonstrates to me that you haven't really been a serious student of it, because
Yeah.
nobody who's a serious student of it thinks that way about it, that there's a biblical view, in
Yeah.
other words.
Yeah.
So that's sort of, I guess, the second thought on that.
Hmm.
But hyperbole doesn't allow for nuance, so that I understand that. And then I guess part of the other thing I think that's interesting in the tweet too is correlation and causation. Yeah, polygamy uh, happened with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of course,
Hmm.
there's polygamy as part of that soup for
Hmm.
sure. But polygamy is also, as they study cultures in human history, they say 80% of the cultures in human history are polygamous.
Hmm.
So, um, you know, they didn't all create Middle East conflicts,
Right.
and all wars in the United States were started by male U.S. presidents.
Hmm.
You know, there,
Hmm.
but I don't think the problem is maleness necessarily, although it could be part of the problem,
Hmm.
testosterone. But again, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. There's a
Yeah.
correlation between male presidents and wars, but I don't think we should eliminate male presidents.
Sure.
Therefore, I mean, so I think again, there's some weird play going on in there,
Yeah.
but yeah, this gets back to again this sort of notion that one man, one woman, one lifetime, that
Hmm.
somehow this is a simple formula that's in the Bible, and
Yep.
that this has been passed down since the beginning of human history, when that's not at all what we see in human history. We see polygamy. We see people who really have no relationship, don't really make a correlation between love and marriage in the same way that we do.
Yeah.
uh, the book of Song of Solomon's a great example of this, or Song of Songs, right? There's this couple, and they're just in love, and they're playing around sexually, and they're having a great time, and it's pretty clear from the context of different clues that we pick up in the book that they're not married.
Yeah.
And so, again, if you want to talk about biblicalness, there it's kind of a glaring, obvious thing that happens here in the middle of the wisdom literature of the Hebrew scriptures.
Yeah, I think with me, like the thing that gets me, and him and I went back and forth a couple of times on Twitter just regarding just this demonization of people who fall outside of this narrow stream of understanding, and particularly about gay marriage, and people
Mhm.
who are sleeping together before they're married, and like just this very narrow view of understanding, and anybody who's outside of that is clearly wrong and going to hell. And so for me it was just like I don't understand that need to pin blame on somebody who's different than I am, and just say that that whole way of living is wrong and is evil. Because polygamy, and I know people who I don't, the word I'm going to say it wrong is polema, people who are
Polyamory.
yes, that's the word. I can never say it right, but I'm just going to let you say it. But that's the word I'm looking for. But I know people who are in those kind of relationships, and they're
Hmm.
very happy, they're very fruitful, like they're living their life, and like who knows if that works for them, that's fine, but like who are we to say that like someone who lives their life that way is evil and wrong and not biblical and everything else, when in reality they might be living a very fruitful lifestyle, might be very close to the Lord, so to speak, and living their life that way. So if things turn in that direction, who's to say it's evil and it's wrong? And that's what I just don't understand.
Yeah, and one of the chapters in the book, I is entitled "Form Follows Function," and it comes from
Mhm.
that sort of notion of that from architectures, where the saying comes from.
Mhm.
That a building, the way a building is created, the form that a building takes should follow what you intend it to be,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
seems obvious. But the whole notion of form following function really is a description of life as we experience it, and in the context of marriage, we would say, the form marriage takes isn't really the big issue here.
Hmm.
It's how does it function in a person's life.
Yeah.
um, not what it looks like on the outside, but what it does. Because we all know people that conform to the norm, to what the stereotypical marriage is supposed to be, who are
Hmm.
absolutely miserable,
Yep.
and whose marriage, the net fruit of their marriage is not love, it's something else.
Yep.
um, and so maybe the question really is how do we create forms of marriage that function lovingly?
Yep.
That seems to me to be the $1 million question. And I don't think there's a simple answer to that. And I think that that answer varies a lot based on, people are different, frankly, and their stages of life are different.
Yep.
The way people relate when you're a newlywed is very different than the way you relate when you've been married for 50 years. My parents are celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary this summer, and I just, in their own life, I just have observed. I mean, the way they relate now is very, very different than the way they did when they had us at home, and the way that
Yeah.
when we were college students, when we were really young kids, when before they had kids, I imagine it was very different as well. And
Yeah.
the different stages of life and the
Yeah.
different things that they, so to say that, there needs to be a form of marriage, or or the way in which we bring out the most love in a marriage should be the same for everybody is ridiculous. Every
Yeah.
marriage is different, and every person is different, and
Yeah.
every the dynamic that they bring together is different too. What
Yeah.
the better question than are you conforming to a normative standard of what it should look like is this functioning to be a place where that's a loving environment for you and for the people around you?
Yeah. So
That
what is it?
seems to be just. Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, I was gonna say, so what does it look like then for a marriage to evolve from this place where it is now in this romantic stage? Like if we evolved 250 years ago from the communal aspect and the survival aspect and the economic aspect into romantic, like now 250 years later, what does it look like to keep evolving within the context of where we live? Because let's put it bluntly, there's laws in place and things like that in the country, like different laws regarding marriage and things like
Sure.
that. So, like, what does it look like to keep evolving in a way that lives within the confines of those laws?
There's legal questions in that, and I think part of the problem that the church kind of got itself into was
Hmm.
that they became agents of the state in marriage, and in Europe that usually is the case. In Europe, you go down to the courthouse and you get married, and then you go to the church and you do a wedding ceremony if you want to do that, if you want a
Yeah.
religious ceremony in addition to it. And so there's this clear delineation between church and state in that.
Hmm.
Our problem is that we don't have that delineation, and like I'm sure when you were a pastor, Glenn, I mean, when you officiated, you had to sign documents from
Yeah.
the county courthouse, saying that you officiated this thing and that it's all good.
Yeah.
And so that creates problems in and of itself, I think, because it's harder to ask these questions now because now you got to involve the state in these questions.
Right.
And that's sort of what made gay marriage complicated in our country as well,
Hmm.
is exactly that, is that, the intertwining of church and state in there. But yeah, I think people are dealing with this in different ways. A lot of people are giving up on marriage. The number of people getting married is going way down, and the divorce rate is going down in part because people are getting married less.
Hmm.
And so it's it's kind of a tricky deal, and I think people are pretty disillusioned with marriage, understandably,
Yeah.
and don't really see the benefit of it. They grew up in a household. I talked to countless people. I grew up in a household where my parents fought all the time, and I'm good. I don't need that in my life at all.
Yeah.
I haven't seen enough of that, and so a
Yeah.
lot of people are just giving up on it. A lot of evangelicals kind of get into let's double down. We just need to try harder. If we try even harder and harder, we can do this. And
Yeah.
and and in some cases, yeah, I think that works for some folks. They certainly they need to learn some tools. They need to figure it out. They need to get better at it, and that certainly is helpful. When I went to Africa, I worked for this nonprofit that did economic development projects in Africa, and one of my first trips over there, I was talking to a African pastor there, and they of course had polygamy,
Hmm.
as part of their practice and in some of their congregations, and I didn't know that, and it kind of surprised me. And I mentioned something to this African pastor, and he said, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you guys have polygamy too in your country." And I said, "Oh no, no, we don't." And he says, "Oh yeah, you do. You just marry different people. You're just serial polygamists instead of like marrying all women at one time. You just marry 4 or 5 women over the course of a lifetime." And
Right.
I thought, yeah, touche. You're right.
Right.
You're exactly
Tomato,
right. So
tomato.
yeah, so serial monogamy is sort of the way some people have dealt with this as well, is sort of just saying, we'll do this till it doesn't work, and then we'll do our hunt for the next soulmate, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, reinventing marriage, I think part of the book was I wasn't trying to provide a manifesto for marriage as much as just begin to open the question to say, you people are smarter than I am. Figure this out. I mean, and you need to figure it out for your own life too. What's working for me probably will not work for you just because we're different.
Yeah.
Everybody's just different enough that we have to sort of find our own way in this. And so part of what I outline in the book is beginning to think about what are the different ways that we need human beings in our lives, that what used to take a village, somebody, we need friendships, we need people, activity partners, we need stability in our lives in terms of a roof over our head and food to eat and those sorts of things. We need parenting partners, we need financial partners to help us professionally, those sorts of things. And again, we're not going to find that in one person. So
Yeah.
how do we divvy that up, into different parts,
Yeah.
and think of marriage not as trying to find one person to do all those things, but one person that we really like that can do some of those things, that we can keep our expectations realistic for them.
So then are you saying that like different relationships in our lives can fulfill these different things? Is that part of
Yeah,
what I'm
that's
hearing?
exact that's exactly it. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've observed people like this all the time, that they um I know a woman who, her husband is pretty closed off emotionally,
Hmm.
and she loves him a lot, but she knows that if she really wants deep emotional connection, she's going to have to get with her friends,
Yep. Yep.
and that's not going to happen with her husband. And she's resigned to that, and she's okay. He does some other things really, really well in their lives, and he's a great parent. He's a great provider and all those sorts of things. But she's just kind of resigned herself to, okay, this is just my expectations of this marriage. It's not going to be that he's going to be that. And then I have other friends, and you probably know people like this
Hmm.
too. I know this woman, she married this guy, and she's like, "I'll marry you, but you're a financial mess, and I do not want to be entangled in this. We're gonna have separate finances. We are
Right.
not going to be financial partners
Don't
in
touch
this."
my money. Right.
Exactly. You are a boat anchor to my finances. And
Right.
so we're going to keep this all separate. And they do everything separately,
Yep.
and just decided that their marriage isn't going to include that piece,
Yeah.
and that's worked for them. They've been able to
Yep.
figure that out.
Yep.
There's other things, other glue that holds them together, that's beyond the financial piece, um, and then, as you mentioned, the polyamory folks, sometimes people get to that point where they're like, you're a great parent, you're a great financial partner, we have this life together, but at the end of the day, I've got to find ways to find, love and romance outside of this,
Yep.
and they do that, and
Yep.
with the consent of their partners in it. And so I think, looking at it from a theological framework, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
It may not be my cup of tea, but
Sure.
again, we're asking a different question. Not what is the form of the marriage, but how does it function?
Yeah.
What's going to bring about the most love, in the marriage and in the community around them. When people only live to be 35, 40 years old, when you said till death do us part in your marriage vows, You know, it was like, yeah, I can put up with 20 years, you
10,
know.
15 years, whatever.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. You know, I can handle this, you know. But you know, my parents, my mom turns 80 this year, you know, again, they've been at it 60 years. That's a whole different commitment
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
than what people used to do. And that's part of the dynamic, I think, in human history that's sort of coming about as well. You know, as we're living longer, you know, now we're asking some different questions, you know.
Yeah.
People are empty nesters and you're going to be empty nesters for 30, 40 years, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
before you die.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I love about the book is that it it makes you ask more questions than it does give answers. Because like I said, I read the book and now I've got like all these questions that I don't know what to do with because it didn't prescribe anything for me necessarily, but it made me
Yeah.
rethink a lot of things that I assumed were just the way that it is. And I think for me, like one of the biggest points in the book is that maybe we need to stop prescribing for everybody what marriage is supposed to be and start thinking about, like you said, not so much the form of it, but the function of it. Like what is the function that you have within the form of your marriage, is it fruitful? Is it benefiting you? Is it benefiting your partner? Is it benefiting the world around you? Because like I remember I worked at Apple for 11 years. And so I came out of the church, pastoring a church with this mindset that this is the way that marriage is, everything else. Started working with, stores of sometimes 100, 150 people in these stores, and you get to know people. And a lot of these
Yeah.
people don't come from religious backgrounds. A lot of them come from different cultural backgrounds. A lot of them are part of the LGBTQ community. A lot of them are just living their lives in drastically different ways than I knew possible in my little tiny church bubble. And I can remember having
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
conversation with somebody who they were older and they were with somebody for like, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 years, but they weren't married. And I remember I said to them, like, why aren't you married? And that was just like a foreign idea to me. And they're like, well,
Yeah.
we just don't need the institution of marriage. It's like, how could you not need the institution of marriage? Like you're already married. It's just a piece of paper. But I couldn't understand the fact that like they were doing things differently than what
Mhm.
the church and even in some ways the state said that they needed to do it. And they were just living their life in this different way. And that began to open up my mind a little bit to think, well, maybe there is a way to be in a functional relationship with somebody that is just different than what the norm is that we've been told is the norm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of, yeah, like you say, and I think that was my experience too. A lot of these, you know, ideas sound great in the ivory tower, you know, of like,
Mhm.
you know, we'll find get everybody conform to this one standard and then everybody will be happy, you know.
Yeah.
Well, reality is much more complicated and much more nuanced than that for sure.
Yeah. And I think it's important too to, try to understand people who are in those different kinds of places, because like I said before,
Right.
going back about Mark, is that it's easy to demonize something we don't understand. When in reality, it's much harder to actually put in the effort to try to understand it. It's harder to have a conversation with somebody like you're in this relationship that is completely foreign to me. I don't understand that at all. I'm not
Yeah.
going to judge you or demonize you, but help me understand why this works for you. And I think by asking those kinds of questions, you begin to understand like, okay, well, that's not going to work for me, but it does work for this person. I can see that the fruit of their relationship is obviously good for them, good for the people in the relationship, and good for the world around them. So how can that be a bad thing if we're judging the tree by the fruit that it gives? And I think that when we put
Right.
in that effort to understand, it can just open up our minds so much more than saying, well, this is what it says here in this book. And, this is what this particular verse says. So I'm going to use it to kind of create my narrow way of understanding. But I think when we open ourselves up to those conversations, we can learn so much more.
Yeah. And what's messy about the Bible too, you know, getting back to you know, Mark and his comments,
Mhm.
is that the Bible says some pretty wacky things about marriage and or doesn't say a lot. You know, Jesus doesn't talk hardly at all about marriage,
That's
which
true.
is and the times that Paul talks about it, it's usually in the context of, yeah, don't do it. You know,
Right.
it's just
Stay
be
away from
single.
that. Yes.
You know, you really don't want all that mess in your life.
Right.
You know, I mean, so if you want to take them seriously, I mean, really, you know, it's kind of it's really tricky. And then the Hebrew scriptures, again, they thought of women as property, you know, and then all kinds of crazy rules that made sense in their context. But you know, but if a man dies, you know, his brother has to marry his wife, you know, kind of thing, and it's like, look, I mean, I love my sister-in-law, but my brother dies, she's on her own,
Right,
kind of
right,
thing.
right, right.
Uh, and so yeah, it's really hard to sort of pick and choose stuff out of the scriptures and to say, well, this is biblical marriage, or this is the way when you think about it, because they thought of marriage very, very differently than the way we do.
Yeah,
And the fact that Jesus never married too, I mean, that's kind of problematic in terms of, the most ideal, what Christians would think of as the most, perfect human who ever lived, decided, nah, I'm not gonna get married.
yeah,
I'm good.
yeah, yeah.
So
It should speak volumes, right? In some way.
yeah, you
Yeah.
would think. You
Yeah, it's
would
funny.
think.
Whenever that topic of biblical marriage comes up, I always say, well, which version of biblical marriage are we talking about? Because I can open up to various books and see various stories about marriage, and a lot of them are very different. So if we're gonna, let's land on a single definition before we move forward,
Yeah,
because there's lots of different ones I think mirrored throughout the different stories of the Bible.
exactly.
All right, so last question for you, because we're getting a little bit short on time. People who are
Yeah.
listening to this, who have just had their mind blown and stretched a little bit, what are the takeaways that you would hope for our listeners, for people who are maybe going to go and pick up your book after this? Like, what are you hoping that they take away from this conversation and use in their lives, their relationships, things like that?
Yeah, my hope for people is, first, I guess, to sort of deconstruct what they think they know about marriage, and
Mm,
to say, it's not quite as simple as you think it is.
yeah,
The
yeah,
history of it, and where we've come from, and how we deal with it, and then hopefully then to give them some tools to say, I want to reinvent marriage in my own life,
yeah.
and think of it not because I'm socially prescribed to do it a particular way, but because this is what works for myself and my partner, and the way in which we live, and the
Mhm.
season of our lives. And so, I try to provide some tools in that to begin to ask those questions of how what is this going to look like for us,
Mhm.
kind of thing. And so that's what I'm really hoping people will do. I'm not trying to give them here's the new right answer, kind
Yeah,
of thing, but to say, you got to figure this out for yourself, because marriage is much more plastic than I think we give it credit for. And
yeah,
so
yeah.
so
I,
let's
lo-
let's let's allow it to be that.
Yeah, and I love that because you're encouraging people to communicate, right, with one another. And I think that's the biggest thing, especially within a marriage, whatever that marriage looks like. Like if you have these needs that aren't being met, whatever those needs might be, and you don't talk about it with the other person, but then you just go try to have those needs met somewhere else, that creates a huge problem in itself because there's a level of dishonesty there, there's a level of hiding. But if you're just open with, like I said before, whether it's about finances, whether it's about romance, whatever it might be, whether it's about just needing somebody to listen to me talk, like if you're open with your partner and you say, I'm not getting this here, let's try to figure out how we can both have our needs met, like that's a much different conversation than, this person's not meeting my needs, so I'm just going to go figure it out myself somewhere else. Like that, I think the
Right.
whole relationship can take a whole nother turn, have a whole nother dynamic when there's that level of communication and openness that's there. And so for me, that's
Exactly.
one of the biggest things I got from this book, is that we just have to know what our needs are, and we have to be honest with the other person with what those needs are.
Actually use our words. How about that?
Yes,
Yeah.
right? Who would have thought? Use our use our words, right? That's awesome. Well, hey, we're just about out of time, but this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for your
Yeah.
work. Thanks for
Thank
taking
you,
time to
Glenn.
join me, and
Of
thanks for what you
course.
do.
I appreciate it a lot. Thanks, Glenn.
Absolutely. And real quick, where can people go online to connect with you, your work, any websites you want to point us to?
Yeah, of course, the book's on Amazon and Audible, and I'm on Facebook and Twitter, just under Dana Robert Hicks. There's not a lot of Dana Robert Hickses out there, luckily. So if you look for those on Amazon, Audible, Facebook, or Twitter, you can probably find me. So
Awesome.
yeah, I'd love to connect with folks who want to talk more too, if they're interested in a conversation. So
Great. I'll put the links in the show notes, and I'm sure we'll do it again sometime.
sounds good. Thanks so much, Glenn.
Thank you.